I'm Michael Davis, 42, and I spent 14 years behind bars for a crime I didn't commit. The morning I was released, I believed my fight was finally over, until a chance encounter 3 months later changed everything. My former public defender approached me outside the courthouse where I was attending a victims' rights meeting. His hands were shaking as he pulled me aside. "Michael, I've carried this guilt for 15 years, he whispered. "I never actually read your case file." "Not once?" The weight of his confession hit me like a freight train, but what he revealed next about the dozens of other cases he'd mishandled would turn my personal tragedy into a mission for justice that neither of us could have imagined. If you've ever wondered how deep corruption can run, like and subscribe because you need to hear this story. To understand how deep this betrayal cut, you need to know where it all began. March 15th, 2009, a date burned into my memory like a brand. I was 28 years old, working 2 jobs to support my family, coming home from my evening shift at the warehouse. My daughter was only 3 then, and my wife was pregnant with our second child. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest work, and we were building something together. I remember pulling into our driveway at 11:47 p.m., the headlights cutting through the darkness of our quiet neighborhood. The porch light was on. My wife always left it on for me. I was exhausted, my back aching from loading trucks for 8 hours, looking forward to a hot shower and maybe catching the late news before bed. That's when I saw the red and blue lights reflecting off my rearview mirror. 2 patrol cars pulled up behind me as I sat in my driveway. My first thought wasn't fear, it was confusion. Had someone broken into our house? Was there an emergency? I stepped out of my car with my hands visible, the way my father had taught me when I was young. "Always show them your hands," he'd said. "Never give them a reason to be afraid." Officer Martinez was the first to approach. I'd seen him around the neighborhood before. He seemed decent enough, had even waved at me once when I was mowing the lawn. But tonight his expression was different, professional, cold. "Michael Davis?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes, sir. Is everything all right? Is my family—" "You're under arrest for the murder of Janet Thompson." The words hit me like a physical blow. Janet Thompson. I knew the name, everyone in our small town did. She'd been found dead in her apartment 2 days earlier. The local news had been covering it, calling it a tragic loss. She was a nurse at the county hospital, well-liked, no enemies that anyone knew of, but I had never met her. Never even seen her, as far as I knew. "There's been a mistake," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know Janet Thompson," but they weren't listening. The handcuffs were already out, the cold metal clicking around my wrists as Officer Martinez recited my rights. My wife appeared at the front door, our daughter in her arms, both of them still in their pajamas. The look of terror in my wife's eyes is something I'll never forget, the moment she realized our world was crumbling. "Daddy?" My daughter called out, her small voice cutting through the chaos. "Daddy, where are you going?" I couldn't answer her. I couldn't find the words to explain something I didn't understand myself. As they put me in the back of the patrol car, I kept telling myself this was temporary, a mistake. Someone would figure it out and I'd be home by morning. I'd kiss my wife, hold my daughter, and we'd laugh about this terrible mix-up. The police report I would later read painted a different picture. According to the investigating officers, an anonymous tip had placed me at Janet Thompson's apartment building on the night of her death. They claimed I'd been seen arguing with her in the hallway. The report was filled with details that seemed precise but felt completely foreign to me. Times, locations, descriptions of clothing I'd never worn. At the station, they put me in a small interrogation room that smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaning solution. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everything look surreal. Detective Reynolds sat across from me, a thick file folder in front of him. "Michael, we know you were there," he said, his voice calm but certain. "We have witnesses, we have evidence. This will go a lot easier if you just tell us what happened." "I wasn't there," I kept repeating. "I've never been to Janet Thompson's apartment. I've never met Janet Thompson." But even as I said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. Not doubt about my guilt, doubt about my honesty. They'd already decided I was lying. The investigation was over before it began. They held me for 3 days before the arraignment. 3 days of phone calls to lawyers I couldn't afford, of trying to explain to my wife that I needed her to believe me when the whole world seemed convinced I was guilty. 3 days of barely eating, barely sleeping, trying to understand how my ordinary life had become a nightmare. That's when I first met him, my court-appointed attorney. He walked into the holding cell area wearing a wrinkled suit and carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen better days. His hair was disheveled, his eyes tired, and he moved with the hurried efficiency of someone who had too many cases and not enough time. "Mr. Davis, I'm your attorney. We need to talk about your case." I felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone who would listen. Someone who would help me prove my innocence. Someone who would fight for me. If only I had known that he would never even read my file. The trial began 6 months later, but I realized something was wrong from the very first day. My attorney, I'll call him Johnson, arrived at the courthouse looking like he'd slept in his car. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie askew, and he carried the same battered briefcase I'd seen that first day in the holding cell. "Are you ready?" I asked him as we sat in the hallway outside the courtroom. My wife was there, 8 months pregnant now, holding our daughter's hand. She'd aged years in those 6 months, stress lines etched around her eyes, her face gaunt from worry. "Ready as we'll ever be," Johnson replied, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He was shuffling through papers in his briefcase, muttering to himself. "Where did I put that witness statement?" A chill ran down my spine. "What witness statement?" "The one from—" He stopped, realizing he'd said too much. "Don't worry about it. I've got everything under control." But I could see he didn't. The way his hands shook as he organized his papers, the way he kept checking his watch like he had somewhere else to be. This wasn't the confident defender I'd hoped for. This was a man drowning in his own caseload. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Stevens, was a different story entirely. She walked into that courtroom like she owned it, her team of assistants carrying neat, organized files. Everything about her presentation screamed competence and preparation. She knew my case better than my own lawyer did. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began her opening statement, "the evidence will show that Michael Davis brutally murdered Janet Thompson in cold blood. We have witnesses who saw him at the scene. We have physical evidence linking him to the crime. And we have a pattern of deception and lies that began the moment he was arrested." I watched the jury's faces as she spoke. They were already convinced. Her words painted a picture of a monster, a cold-blooded killer who had taken the life of an innocent woman. And sitting there in my ill-fitting suit, the only one I owned, I felt every inch the villain she described. When it was Johnson's turn to speak, he stood up slowly, like a man walking to his execution. His opening statement lasted maybe 5 minutes. He talked about reasonable doubt, about the presumption of innocence, but his heart wasn't in it. He was going through the motions, reading from notes that seemed unfamiliar to him. "My client is innocent," he said, his voice barely carrying to the back of the courtroom. "The prosecution's case is built on speculation and circumstantial evidence. When you hear all the facts, you'll see that Michael Davis is not guilty of this terrible crime. But what facts?" As the trial progressed, I realized Johnson didn't know any facts. He hadn't interviewed the witnesses Stevens called. He hadn't examined the physical evidence. He hadn't even visited the crime scene. When the prosecution presented their case, Johnson's cross-examinations were weak, unfocused, based on questions that seemed to come to him in real time. The court transcript from those days tells the story better than I ever could. Page after page of "No questions, Your Honor, and I object," followed by the judge's sustained rulings. Johnson was improvising, and it showed. He was fighting a war without ammunition, and I was the casualty. The prosecution's star witness was Mrs. Henderson, Janet Thompson's elderly neighbor. She testified that she'd seen me in the hallway outside Janet's apartment on the night of the murder. She described my height, my build, even the color of my jacket. Her testimony was detailed, convincing, and completely wrong. Johnson's cross-examination was a disaster. He asked her about her eyesight, about the lighting in the hallway, about whether she'd been drinking that night. But he did it without preparation, without knowing her background. Without any strategy, Mrs. Henderson remained calm and confident, repeating her identification of me as the man she'd seen. "I know what I saw," she said firmly. "That's the man who was arguing with Janet." Johnson had no evidence to contradict her. No alibi witnesses, no timeline that would exonerate me, no alternative theories about who the real killer might be. He was flying blind and the jury could see it. The physical evidence was equally damning. The prosecution presented a jacket found in a dumpster near the crime scene, a jacket that looked similar to one I owned. They had a partial fingerprint on Janet's door that they claimed was mine. They had testimony from the coroner about the time of death, all of it pointing to me. Johnson's response was to question the chain of custody, to suggest that the evidence might have been contaminated. But his challenges were half-hearted, technically weak. He didn't understand the forensic science well enough to mount a real defense. During one particularly painful cross-examination of the forensics expert, Johnson asked, "Isn't it true that fingerprints can be planted?" The expert looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Planted? Are you suggesting that the police planted evidence?" "I'm just asking if it's possible." "Technically, anything is possible, counselor. But do you have any evidence that happened here?" Johnson looked down at his notes, then back at the expert. No further questions. I wanted to scream. This was my life, my freedom, my family's future, and my lawyer was asking questions he didn't know the answers to. I could see the jury's expressions shifting from attention to impatience to disgust. They weren't just convicting me, they were losing respect for the entire process. The worst part was the witnesses Johnson never called. My wife, who could testify about my character, about the kind of man I was. My co-workers, who could speak to my whereabouts and my routine. The security guard at my workplace, who might have had records of when I left that night. These people existed, but Johnson never contacted them. I tried to tell him during our brief meetings. "My supervisor keeps timesheets," I said. "He'd know exactly when I left work." Right, Johnson replied, scribbling something in his notebook. "I'll look into that," but he never did. That supervisor, those timesheets, that potential alibi, none of it ever made it into the courtroom. Years later, I would learn that my timesheet from that night showed I was still at work 20 minutes after the prosecution claimed I was at Janet's apartment. 20 minutes that could have saved my life. The trial lasted only 4 days. 4 days to destroy everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, everything I'd hoped for. When the jury returned with their verdict, the foreman's voice was steady and certain. "We find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree." My wife's scream still echoes in my nightmares. My daughter, now 4 years old, didn't understand why Mommy was crying, why Daddy was being led away in handcuffs. The bailiff's grip on my arm was firm but not unkind even. He seemed to understand that something wasn't right. Johnson packed up his briefcase and left without saying goodbye. I wouldn't see him again for 15 years, and when I did, he would finally tell me the truth that he'd never even read my case file. The steel doors of Riverside Correctional Facility clanged shut behind me on a gray October morning in 2009. The sound was final, absolute, like the period at the end of a death sentence. I was led through a maze of corridors, each one more sterile and unwelcoming than the last, until I reached my new home, Cell Block D, Unit 47. My cellmate was a man named Rico who'd been inside for 8 years on armed robbery charges. He was sitting on his bunk reading a paperback novel when the guard unlocked the door and shoved me inside. "Fresh meat," the guard said with a smirk. "Play nice, Rico." Rico looked up from his book and studied me with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to read people quickly. "First time inside?" I nodded, unable to find my voice. "What did you do?" "I'm innocent," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Rico's expression didn't change, but I caught something in his eyes, not mockery exactly, but a kind of weary recognition. "Yeah, man, we all are." That first night I lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the prison settling around me. Voices echoing through the corridors, the clang of metal doors, the endless hum of fluorescent lights that never turned off. I thought about my wife at home, probably struggling to get our daughter to sleep, probably crying herself to sleep like she had every night since my arrest. 3 weeks into my sentence, I received my first letter. The envelope was pale blue, and I recognized my daughter's attempt at writing her name in the corner. Inside, along with a brief note from my wife, was a drawing my daughter had made stick figures of our family, with me conspicuously absent. At the bottom, in my wife's handwriting, "Daddy's away, but he loves you very much." I held that letter for hours, reading it over and over until the words blurred through my tears. This was what innocence looked like in prison, not the dramatic proclamations I'd imagined, but the quiet grief of a man watching his life slip away one letter at a time. The other inmates' reactions to my claims of innocence varied. Some, like Rico, had heard it all before and remained politely skeptical. Others were more direct in their disbelief. Tony, a lifer who controlled most of the black market cigarette trade in our block, cornered me in the yard after a few weeks. "Davis, you seem like a decent guy," he said, his voice low and measured. "But this innocent act ain't gonna fly in here. Everyone's got a story. Everyone's got an excuse. But the truth is, we're all here because we did something wrong." "But I didn't," I started to say. "Listen," Tony interrupted. "I'm not saying you're lying. I'm saying it doesn't matter. Guilty or innocent, you're here now. And if you want to survive, you need to stop thinking about what you lost and start thinking about what you can build." His words stung because they contained a grain of truth I wasn't ready to accept. The justice system had failed me, but dwelling on that failure wouldn't change my circumstances. I was going to be here for a long time, and I had to find a way. To live with that reality, the psychological toll was relentless. Every morning, I woke up hoping it was all a nightmare, only to see the gray walls of my cell and remember where I was. I started having panic attacks moments when the walls seemed to close in and I couldn't breathe. The prison psychologist, Dr. Martinez, prescribed medication and offered weekly counseling sessions. "Tell me about your family," she said during one of our sessions. I showed her the latest letter from my wife, written on paper that still smelled faintly of her perfume. "She's struggling," I admitted. "She's 8 months pregnant, trying to take care of our daughter alone. The neighbors whisper when she walks by. Some people think she's married to a murderer." The letter from my daughter arrived on a Tuesday in December. The prison mailroom had stamped it with the date, and I could see that it had been opened and inspected before reaching me. My wife's handwriting was on the envelope, but when I opened it, I found a Christmas card made from construction paper. And crayon dot inside, in my daughter's careful 5-year-old handwriting, "Dear Daddy, Mommy says you can't come home for Christmas. I made you a present, but I can't mail it. I love you. Are you coming home for my birthday?" I sat on my bunk and wept. Not the quiet, controlled tears I'd grown accustomed to, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place I didn't know existed. Rico pretended not to notice, but I caught him glancing over with something that might have been sympathy. "Doc, the reality of my situation was becoming clear. I was missing my daughter's childhood. I was missing my son's birth. My wife had delivered him 2 months after my conviction, and I'd only seen him in photographs. I was missing birthdays, holidays, bedtime stories, scraped knees that needed bandaging, report cards that needed celebrating. But perhaps the cruelest part was the doubt I began to see in my wife's letters. She never said it directly, but I could read between the lines. The questions became more pointed. Are you sure you're telling me everything? The visits became less frequent. The letters became shorter. By my second year inside, the visits had stopped altogether. My wife's last letter was brief and devastating. Michael, I can't do this anymore. I need to protect our children. I need to move on. I'm sorry. I understood her decision even as it destroyed me. She was young, alone, trying to raise 2 children on her own while carrying the stigma of being married to a convicted murderer. I couldn't give her the life she deserved. Couldn't be the father my children needed. That's when I found the letter, the one that would become my lifeline. My anchor in the storm of despair that threatened to drown me. It was tucked between the pages of a book Rico had lent me, written in my daughter's handwriting from months earlier, before the visits stopped. Daddy, I know you didn't do the bad thing. Mommy cries, but I still believe you. Come home soon. I folded that letter carefully and kept it in my shirt pocket, close to my heart. Even if the whole world had given up on me, my daughter still believed. That had to be enough to keep me going. Johnson had promised me an appeal during our last meeting before sentencing. "Don't worry," he'd said, his voice carrying the same distracted tone I'd grown to dread. "We'll file the paperwork as soon as possible." There were obvious errors in the trial. The judge should have thrown out that fingerprint evidence. I clung to those words during my first months in prison. An appeal meant hope. It meant another chance to prove my innocence, to expose the mistakes that had led to my conviction. Every day I expected to hear from Johnson's office, to receive papers to sign or questions to answer about my case. Instead, I got silence. 3 months passed. Then 6, I wrote letters to Johnson's office asking about the status of my appeal. The responses, when they came at all, were brief and evasive. "Your case is being reviewed. We're preparing the necessary documentation. Please be patient." But patience was a luxury I couldn't afford. Every day that passed was another day. Away from my children, another day the real killer walked free. I needed action, not platitudes. Finally, after 8 months of waiting, I received a letter that changed everything. It wasn't from Johnson's office, it was from the court clerk, informing me that the deadline for filing my appeal had passed. According to the letter, my attorney had never submitted the required paperwork. My right to appeal had expired. I read that letter 3 times before its meaning sank in. Johnson had abandoned me. Not just failed me, abandoned me. While I'd been sitting in my cell, trusting that he was working on my case, he'd been doing nothing. The unopened legal brief I would later discover in his office told the entire story, pages of arguments about prosecutorial misconduct, about inadequate jury instructions, about the contaminated evidence that should have been excluded, arguments that were never made because Johnson never bothered to file them. The rage that consumed me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I screamed until my throat was raw, pounded on my cell door until my knuckles bled. The guards came running, thinking there was an emergency. In a way, there was. My faith in the system, already hanging by a thread, had finally snapped. "You need to calm down, Davis," Sergeant Morrison said as he opened my cell door. "What's got you so worked up?" I showed him the letter from the court clerk. Morrison read it slowly, his expression growing more serious with each line. "Damn," he said quietly. "That's rough, man, really rough." Coming from a prison guard, that acknowledgement of injustice meant more than I could have imagined. Even the people who worked in the system could see how badly it had failed me. Rico tried to console me that night. "Look, man, appeals are tough anyway. Most of them get denied. Maybe it's better this way. You're not getting your hopes up for nothing." But I couldn't accept that. Somewhere out there, the real killer was living free while I rotted in prison. Johnson's negligence hadn't just cost me my freedom, it had cost Janet, Thompson's family, their chance at real justice. That's when I decided to become my own lawyer. If the system wouldn't help me, I'd help myself. The prison library became my second home. I spent hours every day reading law books, studying cases similar to mine, learning about criminal procedure and constitutional rights. The other inmates thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. Knowledge was the only weapon I had left. The law librarian, Mrs. Chen, was a retired paralegal who volunteered at the prison twice a week. She took pity on me, guiding me toward the right resources, explaining legal concepts I couldn't understand on my own. "You're fighting an uphill battle," she told me one afternoon as I struggled through a particularly dense appeals court decision. "The system is designed to make it difficult for pro se litigants, people representing themselves, but it's not impossible." She was right about the uphill battle. Every legal document I filed was scrutinized more carefully than those submitted by licensed attorneys. Every argument I made was dismissed more readily. The courts seemed to assume that because I was representing myself, I didn't know what I was doing, but I kept fighting. I filed motions for post-conviction relief, arguing that Johnson's failure to file an appeal constituted ineffective assistance of counsel. I submitted requests for DNA testing on evidence that hadn't been available during my original trial. I wrote letters to journalists, to Innocence Projects, to anyone who might listen. Most of my efforts were unsuccessful. The courts rejected my motions on procedural grounds. The journalists ignored my letters. The Innocence Projects were overwhelmed with cases and couldn't take on another one without new evidence, but I learned something valuable during those years of self-representation. The law was both more complex and more arbitrary than I'd ever imagined. Justice wasn't about truth, it was about procedure, about technicalities, about who had the better lawyer. Johnson's failure to file my appeal wasn't just negligence, it was a symptom of a system that treated poor defendants as disposable. The most frustrating part was discovering how winnable my case might have been. In my research, I found similar cases where convictions had been overturned due to the same types of errors that had occurred in my trial. The misidentification by Mrs. Henderson, the questionable fingerprint evidence, the lack of physical evidence linking me to the crime. These were all issues that a competent attorney could have successfully challenged, but Johnson hadn't been competent. He'd been overworked, underpaid, and apparently uninterested in actually defending his clients. The unopened legal brief in his office would later reveal that he'd never even read the police reports, never interviewed the witnesses, never examined the evidence. He'd been flying blind from the very beginning. Years later, I would learn that Johnson was handling over 150 felony cases at the time of my trial. 150. It was impossible for any attorney to give adequate attention to that many clients. The system had set him up to fail, and I had paid the price. But in those dark years after my appeal deadline passed, I didn't know about Johnson's caseload. I only knew that he had failed me, and that failure had cost me everything. The unopened legal brief sitting in his office might as well have been my death warrant, a document that could have saved my life, abandoned and forgotten like the man it was meant to help. By my third year in prison, I had reached what I thought was rock bottom. My family was gone, my appeals had failed, and my hopes for justice seemed like naive fantasies. But sometimes, when you think you can't fall any further, you discover that you're actually standing on solid ground. It started with a simple conversation in the prison yard. I was sitting alone, as I usually did, when a younger inmate named Carlos approached me. He was maybe 22, serving time for drug possession, and he looked scared. "Hey, man," he said, glancing around nervously. "I heard you know about legal stuff. Could you maybe help me with something?" I looked at him skeptically. "What kind of help?" "My lawyer says I should take a plea deal, but I think the search that got me arrested was illegal. I just don't know how to prove it." Something in his voice reminded me of myself 3 years earlier, desperate, confused, trusting a system that didn't care about him. I could have turned him away, told him to figure it out himself, but I didn't. "Tell me what happened," I said. Carlos's case was straightforward. The police had searched his car without a warrant or probable cause, finding the drugs that led to his arrest. His public defender, a different lawyer from Johnson, but cut from the same cloth, had never challenged the search. He'd just advised Carlos to plead guilty and hope for a lenient sentence. I spent the next week helping Carlos research Fourth Amendment law, teaching him about probable cause and illegal searches. When he filed a motion to suppress the evidence, citing cases I'd found in the law library, his lawyer was shocked. The motion was granted, and without the illegally obtained evidence, the prosecutor had no case. Carlos walked free. Word spread quickly through the prison. Soon, other inmates were approaching me with legal questions, asking for help with their cases. I found myself running an informal legal aid clinic from my cell, helping men who couldn't afford real lawyers and had been failed by the ones they'd been assigned. There was Jimmy, a mentally disabled man who'd been coerced into confessing to a robbery he didn't commit. I helped him file a motion arguing that his confession was involuntary, and his sentence was reduced from 15 years to 5. There was Marcus, an elderly man whose court-appointed attorney had literally slept through parts of his trial. I helped him document the ineffective assistance of counsel, and his conviction was overturned. Each small victory felt like a kind of redemption. I couldn't save myself, but I could help others navigate the same broken system that had destroyed my life. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd become a better lawyer in prison than Johnson had ever been in a courtroom. The prison administration noticed my activities and wasn't entirely pleased. Warden Foster called me into his office one day, 6 months after I'd started helping other inmates. "Davis, I understand you've been providing legal advice to other prisoners," he said, his tone neutral but watchful. "I've been helping people understand their rights," I replied carefully. "There's nothing illegal about that." "No, there isn't," he agreed. "But I want to make sure you understand the boundaries. You're not a licensed attorney. You can't practice law." "I'm not practicing law," I said. "I'm just helping people research their cases, find relevant statutes, understand procedures. Everything I do, they could do themselves if they had the education and resources." Foster studied me for a long moment. "Davis, I've been reading about your case. The circumstances of your conviction are unusual." That was the closest anyone in authority had come to acknowledging that I might actually be innocent. It wasn't much, but it was something. "I've also been watching what you're doing with the other inmates," he continued. "You're having a positive impact. Several men have had their sentences reduced or overturned because of your help. That's not something I see very often." He paused, then made a decision that would change the trajectory of my prison experience. "I'm going to recommend you for the prison's paralegal training program. It's a new initiative designed to help inmates develop job skills for when they're released. Interested?" I was more than interested. The program was intense 6 months of coursework covering legal research, document preparation, and case analysis. It was taught by actual attorneys who volunteered their time, and for the first time since my arrest, I felt like I was being treated as something more than just another convicted felon. My instructor, Attorney Helena Walsh, was a former public defender who'd left the system after becoming disillusioned with its failures. She recognized something in me that I'd almost forgotten existed: intelligence, determination, and a genuine desire to help others. "You have a natural aptitude for legal analysis," she told me after reviewing one of my assignments. "Have you ever considered becoming a paralegal when you're released?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on proving my innocence that I'd never thought about what I might do if I remained in prison for the full 15 years. But Helena's words planted a seed. Maybe I could find purpose in this broken system, even if I couldn't escape it. When I completed the program, I received a certificate that felt more valuable than any diploma I'd ever earned. It was proof that I was more than my conviction, more than the label murderer that had been attached to my name. I was someone who could make a difference. Even from behind bars, the certificate became my most treasured possession, more important than my daughter's letter, more meaningful than any legal brief I'd written. It represented hope, not hope for my own freedom, which seemed increasingly unlikely, but hope that I could help others avoid the fate that had befallen me. Armed with my new credentials, I expanded my legal assistance work. I helped dozens of inmates over the following years, some successfully appealing their convictions, others winning sentence reductions, still others simply gaining a better understanding of their rights and options. I couldn't save myself, but I could save others. The irony was profound. In trying to destroy my life, the system had inadvertently created something it desperately needed: an advocate for the forgotten, the abandoned, the failed. My wrongful conviction had turned me into the lawyer Johnson never was, fighting for justice from the inside of a system that had already given up on the very people it was supposed to protect. But even as I found purpose in helping others, I never stopped fighting for my own freedom. Every successful case I worked on reminded me of the possibilities that had been stolen from me, the appeals that had never been filed, the evidence that had never been challenged. My certificate was proof of what I could accomplish when someone actually cared about the outcome. If only Johnson had cared enough to read my case file. In my 7th year of imprisonment, hope arrived in the form of a documentary I watched in the prison recreation room. It was about the Innocence Project, an organization that used DNA testing to exonerate wrongfully convicted prisoners. As I watched story after story of men walking free after decades behind bars, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: possibility. The documentary featured a man named James Richardson, who'd spent 18 years in prison for a rape he didn't commit. His case was remarkably similar to mine: a rushed trial, inadequate legal representation, and evidence that was never properly tested. When DNA technology advanced enough to test the evidence, it proved his innocence beyond any doubt. I never gave up hope. Richardson said in his interview. Even when everyone told me to accept my fate, I knew the truth would come out eventually. That night, I lay in my bunk thinking about Richardson's words. The truth would come out eventually. Maybe. Not through the traditional appeals process, maybe not through the lawyers who'd already failed me, but through science. Through DNA testing that hadn't been available during my original trial, I spent the next week researching the Innocence Project in the law library, learning about their criteria for taking cases, their success rate, their process. What I discovered was both encouraging and daunting. They'd helped exonerate hundreds of innocent people, but they received thousands of requests for help each year. They could only take on cases where DNA evidence existed, and where that evidence might prove innocence. The question was, did such evidence exist in my case? I pulled out my trial transcripts and studied them with new eyes. The prosecution had presented several pieces of physical evidence: the jacket found in the dumpster, the partial fingerprint on Janet Thompson's door, and hair samples found at the crime scene. But in 2009, DNA testing of hair samples was limited, and the prosecution had relied primarily on visual comparison by forensic experts. Now, nearly a decade later, DNA testing had advanced significantly. Those same hair samples that had been deemed consistent with my hair might now be definitively tested. And if they didn't match my DNA, they might point to the real killer. I spent 3 days crafting my letter to the Innocence Project. I knew I might only get one chance to make my case, so every word had to count. I detailed my conviction, the evidence that had been presented, the failures of my original attorney, and the potential for DNA testing to prove my innocence. The letter was 8 pages long, handwritten on prison stationery, and it contained everything I'd learned about the law, about my case, and about the possibility of exoneration. I poured my heart into those pages, knowing they might be my last hope for freedom. Dear Innocence Project, I wrote, my name is Michael Davis, and I have been wrongfully imprisoned for 7 years for a murder I did not commit. I am writing to request your assistance in proving my innocence through DNA testing that was not available during my original trial. I outlined the facts of my case methodically, like the paralegal I'd become. I explained the problems with the eyewitness identification, the questionable fingerprint evidence, and the hair samples that had never been properly tested. I included copies of relevant court documents, police reports, and expert testimony, but beyond the legal arguments, I tried to convey the human cost of my wrongful conviction. I wrote about my children who barely remembered me. I wrote about my wife who'd been forced to start a new life without me. I wrote about the real killer who was still free while I rotted in prison. I don't just want my freedom, I concluded. I want justice for Janet Thompson and her family. The real killer has never been caught, and as long as I remain in prison, for his crime he never will be. DNA testing could not only prove my innocence, but could also identify the person who actually committed this terrible crime. Mailing the letter was one of the most terrifying things I'd ever done. It represented my last, best hope for freedom, and I had no idea if anyone would even read it. The Innocence Project received thousands of similar letters each year. What made mine special? The waiting was agony. Days turned into weeks, into months. I checked my mail obsessively, hoping for any word from the Innocence Project. Other inmates began to notice my anxiety. Still waiting to hear from those DNA people? Rico asked one day as I stared at yet another envelope that wasn't from the Innocence Project. Yeah, I said, trying to hide my disappointment. I know they're busy. You just want to go home, Rico finished. I get it, man, but you've been here 7 years. You've built a life inside these walls. Maybe it's time to accept that this is where you belong. Rico meant well, but his words stung. I hadn't built a life in prison, I'd built a survival strategy. Every day I spent behind bars was a day stolen from my real life, my real family, my real future. I would never accept that I belonged here. 4 months after mailing my letter, I received a response. The envelope bore the Innocence Project's logo, and my hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a form letter, polite but devastating. Thank you for contacting the Innocence Project. We receive thousands of requests for assistance each year, and can only take on cases where DNA evidence exists and where that evidence has a reasonable probability of proving innocence. After reviewing your case, we have determined that we cannot provide assistance at this time. The letter went on to explain that they were a small organization with limited resources, that their decision didn't reflect any judgment about my guilt or innocence, and that I should continue to pursue other legal remedies. But the message was clear. I was on my own. I read that letter a dozen times, looking for any hint of hope, any suggestion that they might reconsider. But there was nothing. Just a polite rejection of my last chance at freedom. The depression that followed was deeper than anything I'd experienced since my conviction. I stopped helping other inmates with their cases, stopped going to the library, stopped caring about anything beyond the basic necessities of survival. I'd pinned everything on the Innocence Project, and their rejection felt like a final judgment, but Helena Walsh, my former instructor, noticed my change in behavior during one of her monthly visits to the prison. "Michael, you seem different," she said. "What's going on?" I showed her the rejection letter from the Innocence Project. She read it carefully, then looked at me with understanding eyes. "This isn't the end," she said firmly. "It's just the beginning. The Innocence Project isn't the only organization that helps wrongfully convicted prisoners. There are others, and DNA technology is advancing all the time. What you need to do is document everything, preserve all the evidence, and keep fighting." Her words reignited something in me. She was right. The Innocence Project's rejection wasn't a verdict on my innocence. It was just one organization's assessment of their ability to help. There were other paths to freedom, other ways to prove my innocence. I went back to my cell that night and pulled out the handwritten letter I'd sent to the Innocence Project. Every word was burned into my memory, every argument carefully crafted, every piece of evidence methodically presented. That letter had been my first attempt at proving my innocence through DNA testing. It wouldn't be my last. 2 years after the Innocence Project rejection, salvation came from an unexpected source. I was working in the prison library when Mrs. Chun approached me with a newspaper clipping. Her expression was serious, almost excited. "Michael, you need to see this," she said, handing me the article. "It's about your case." The headline read, "Cold Case Unit Reopens 2009 Murder Investigation." My heart stopped as I read the details. The county had formed a new cold case unit, and they were reviewing unsolved murders from the past 15 years. Janet Thompson's case was on their list. "But I was convicted," I said, confused. "How is it still considered unsolved?" Mrs. Chun pointed to a quote from Detective Sarah Foster, who headed the new unit. "A conviction doesn't always mean a case is truly solved. We're looking at cases where questions remain, where evidence might not have been fully explored, where advances in forensic science might shed new light on what really happened." The article went on to explain that the cold case unit had received a federal grant specifically for DNA testing of evidence from older cases. They were prioritizing cases where the original investigation might have been flawed or where new forensic techniques could provide additional insights. I read the article 3 times, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing. After 9 years of fighting alone, the system was finally willing to take another look at my case. But I wasn't naive. I knew this was just a possibility, not a guarantee. That evening I wrote to Detective Foster. I explained that I was the person convicted of Janet Thompson's murder, that I maintained my innocence, and that I believed DNA testing of the evidence could prove that someone else committed the crime. I was careful to be respectful, professional, and factual. I couldn't afford to sound like another desperate convict making wild claims. The response came faster than I'd expected. Detective Foster wrote back within 2 weeks, and her letter was nothing like the form rejection I'd received from the Innocence Project. "Mr. Davis, I've reviewed your case file, and I agree that there are questions worth exploring. The hair samples found at the crime scene were never subjected to modern DNA testing, and the fingerprint evidence was less conclusive than the prosecution suggested. I can't promise anything, but I believe your case merits further investigation." She explained that the cold case unit was preparing to submit evidence from several cases for DNA testing, including mine. The process would take months, possibly longer, But for the first time in nearly a decade, someone in law enforcement was taking my claims of innocence seriously. The waiting period was excruciating. Every day felt like a year as I wondered whether the DNA results would vindicate me or confirm my worst fears. What if the evidence did match me? What if my memories of that night were somehow wrong? What if I really had committed this crime and blocked it from my mind? Rico, who'd been my cellmate for 10 years now, tried to keep me grounded. "Don't get your hopes up too high," he said one evening as I paced our small cell. "DNA evidence can be complicated. Even if it doesn't match you, it might not be enough to overturn your conviction," but I couldn't help hoping. The DNA test results represented more than just evidence, they represented truth. After a decade of legal technicalities and procedural failures, science would finally provide an objective answer to the question that had haunted me: who killed Janet Thompson? The results arrived on a Tuesday in March, exactly 10 years after my arrest. Detective Foster had driven to the prison personally to deliver them, which I took as either a very good sign or a very bad one. We met in the warden's office, with Warden Foster present as a witness. Detective Foster opened a thick manila envelope and pulled out a laboratory report. Her expression was carefully neutral, but I thought I detected something like excitement in her eyes. "Michael," she said, "the DNA results are back. The hair samples found at the crime scene do not match your DNA." The words hit me like a physical blow. After 10 years of imprisonment, science had finally proven what I'd known all along: I was innocent. But Detective Foster wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, the DNA profile from the hair samples matches a profile in the FBI's combined DNA index system. We've identified the person whose DNA was found at the crime scene. I could barely breathe. Not only had the DNA evidence exonerated me, but it had also identified the real killer. After a decade of fighting, the truth was finally coming to light. "The DNA belongs to a man named Thomas Crawford," Detective Foster explained. "He's currently serving time in a federal prison for armed robbery. He has a history of violent crimes, and he was living in the area at the time of Janet Thompson's murder." The room was spinning. Thomas Crawford. I'd never heard the name before, but this man had destroyed my life. While I'd been rotting in prison, he'd been free to commit other crimes. Janet Thompson's real killer had been walking free while I paid. For his crime, what happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now we build a case," Detective Foster said. "The DNA evidence is strong, but we need to investigate Crawford's whereabouts on the night of the murder, look for additional evidence, and prepare for the legal process of overturning your conviction." She explained that the process would still take time. The district attorney's office would need to review the new evidence, and there would be legal proceedings to vacate my conviction. But for the first time in 10 years, I had something I'd almost forgotten existed: hope based on facts rather than faith. That night, I called my daughter. We'd been exchanging letters sporadically over the years, but this was the first time I'd spoken to her in nearly a decade. She was 15 now, almost an adult, and her voice was so much deeper than I remembered. "Dad," she said when she heard my voice, "is it really you?" "It's me, baby," I said, tears streaming down my face. "And I have something important to tell you. The DNA results came back. I'm innocent. We can prove it now." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like hours. Then I heard her crying, and through her tears, she said the words I'd been waiting 10 years to hear. "I knew it, Dad. I always knew you didn't do it." The DNA test results weren't just evidence, they were vindication. They were proof that my faith in the truth had been justified, that my refusal to accept guilt for a crime I didn't commit had been right. They were the key to unlocking not just my cell, but my future. Thomas Crawford's DNA had been at Janet Thompson's crime scene. Not mine, never mine. The science was clear, objective, and irrefutable. After 10 years of legal battles, the truth was finally on my side, but even as I celebrated this breakthrough, I couldn't forget the tragic irony. The DNA evidence that proved my innocence had been sitting in a police storage room for 10 years. If Johnson had been competent, if he'd demanded proper testing, if he'd even bothered to read my case file, This evidence could have been discovered a decade earlier. 10 years of my life had been stolen not just by the real killer, but by a system that had failed at every level. The DNA results would eventually free me, but they couldn't give me back the years I'd lost or the family I'd been separated from. Still, as I held Detective Foster's report in my hands, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a decade: certainty. The truth was finally coming to light, and with it, the possibility of real justice, not just for me, but for Janet Thompson and her family. The DNA evidence was more than proof of my innocence. It was proof that the system could be redeemed, that truth could triumph over negligence, and that even the most broken cases could be made whole again. The DNA evidence was just the beginning. Detective Foster had warned me that proving my innocence and actually getting my conviction overturned were two different battles, and she was right. The legal system that had failed me once seemed reluctant to admit its mistake, even when faced with scientific proof. The motion for a new trial was filed by a court-appointed attorney, ironically, the same type of lawyer who'd failed me the first time. But this attorney, Rachel Murphy, was different. She was young, idealistic, and genuinely outraged by what had happened to me. "This is exactly the kind of case that made me want to become a lawyer," she told me during our first meeting. "The system failed you catastrophically, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make it right." Murphy worked tirelessly to build our case. The motion for a new trial was comprehensive, detailing not just the DNA evidence but also the numerous failures of my original defense. She interviewed witnesses who had never been contacted during my original trial, uncovered police reports that Johnson had never reviewed, and documented a pattern of negligence that was staggering in its scope. The most powerful part of our motion was the new evidence about Thomas Crawford. Detective Foster's investigation had revealed that Crawford had been in the area on the night of Janet Thompson's murder, that he'd been questioned by police as a potential suspect but released without DNA testing, and that he'd committed similar crimes in other jurisdictions. During the months leading up to the hearing, something unexpected happened. The media began to take notice of my case. A local reporter named Jennifer Walsh had covered my original trial and remembered being troubled by the weak evidence. When she learned about the DNA results, she began investigating the story. Her first article was devastating to the prosecution's case. She interviewed Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor who'd identified me as the man she'd seen in Janet Thompson's hallway. Now 85 and suffering from dementia, Mrs. Henderson barely remembered the incident. When shown a photo of Thomas Crawford, she seemed just as certain that he was the man she'd seen. The publicity brought unexpected support. Letters arrived from strangers who'd read about my case and wanted to help. A local church raised money for my legal fees. Law students from the university offered to help with research. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone, but the most meaningful support came from my family. My daughter, now 16, wrote me a letter that I still carry with me today. "Dad, I know I was too young to understand what happened when you were arrested, but I want you to know that I never stopped believing in you. I can't wait to hug you when you come home." The hearing finally arrived in September, 13 months after the DNA results had been revealed. The courtroom was packed with supporters, reporters, and curious onlookers. Judge Martinez seemed genuinely troubled by what he'd learned during his review of the evidence. Murphy's presentation was masterful. She walked the court through the DNA evidence methodically, showing how it not only excluded me, but also implicated Crawford. The prosecution's response was weak, arguing that the DNA evidence was insufficient to overturn my conviction, but their heart wasn't in it. When Judge Martinez rendered his decision, his voice was heavy with emotion. "The court finds that the newly discovered DNA evidence, combined with the documented failures of the original defense, constitutes clear and convincing evidence of Mr. Davis's innocence. The motion for a new trial is granted, and all charges against Mr. Davis are hereby dismissed." The courtroom erupted. My daughter was crying, Murphy was smiling, and I was finally free. The moment I walked out of Riverside Correctional Facility on October 12, 2023, I felt like I was stepping into an alien world. 14 years had passed since I'd been a free man, and everything had changed. The air smelled different, the cars looked different, and the people walking by were all staring at screens. I didn't recognize my daughter was waiting for me at the gates. 17 years old now, barely recognizable as the 3-year-old who'd watched me get arrested. She was taller than I'd expected. With her mother's eyes and a strength I could see had been forged through years of dealing with having an incarcerated father. "Dad," she said, and that single word contained 14 years of loss, hope, and love. I held her for what felt like hours, both of us crying, both of us trying to bridge the gap that prison had created between us. She was almost an adult now, had lived most of her life without me, and I was a stranger trying to be her father. "I'm so proud of you," I whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. You're here now," she said. "That's what matters." The exoneration certificate I carried in my pocket was more than just a legal document. It was proof that the nightmare was over, that I was officially innocent, that the system had finally admitted its mistake. But holding that certificate, I realized it couldn't give me back the years I'd lost or the relationships that had been destroyed. The world I'd returned to was bewildering. Smartphones, social media, ride-sharing apps technology had advanced dramatically while I'd been frozen in time. My daughter had to teach me how to use a phone that was more powerful than the computers I'd known before my arrest. "Dad, it's like you're from another planet," she said, laughing as I struggled to understand how to send a text message. "But don't worry, I'll teach you everything." The practical challenges were immediate and overwhelming. I had no credit history, no work experience for the past 14 years, nowhere to live. The state had given me $200 and a bus ticket compensation for 14 years of wrongful imprisonment. It was insulting, but it was all I had. My daughter's mother, my ex-wife, had agreed to let me stay in their guest room temporarily while I got back on my feet. It was awkward, painful, and necessary. She'd remarried, had another child, and built a life that I was now disrupting simply by existing. "I don't want to make this harder than it has to be," I told her the first night I was there. "I just need some time to figure things out." "Michael, you're my daughter's father," she said. "You're welcome here as long as you need. I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I couldn't wait." Her apology meant more than she could know. For years I'd carried the pain of her abandonment, the knowledge that even the person who'd promised to love me forever had given up on my innocence. But I understood her choice now. She'd been young, alone, and trying to protect her children from a world that saw them as the family of a murderer, the media attention that had helped secure. My freedom now felt overwhelming. Reporters called constantly, wanting interviews, wanting to know how it felt to be free, wanting me to express outrage about my wrongful conviction. But I wasn't ready to be angry yet. I was still trying to process the fact that I was free. The first night in a real bed was surreal. For 14 years, I'd slept on a thin prison mattress, surrounded by concrete walls and the constant noise of other inmates. Now I was in a quiet suburban house, in a room with windows that actually opened, with a door that I could close and open at will. I couldn't sleep. The silence was too loud, the bed too soft, the room too open. I found myself getting up every few hours to make sure the door was still unlocked, to remind myself that I was really freed. My son, now 14, was curious about me but cautious. He'd grown up knowing he had a father in prison, but I was more myth than reality to him, without me, and I could see him trying to figure out who I was and where I fit in his world. "Do you remember anything about before?" he asked me one evening as we sat in the backyard. "I remember the day you were born," I said. "I was in county jail, waiting for trial. Your mother sent me a picture. You were so small, so perfect. I cried when I saw it." "I wish I could remember you," he said quietly. "Everyone else has memories of their dads. I just have stories." His words broke my heart. I'd missed his entire childhood, first steps, first words, birthday parties, school plays, little league games. All of it had happened while I was locked away for something I didn't do. The guilt was crushing. Not guilt for Janet Thompson's murder. I knew I was innocent of that. But guilt for what my wrongful conviction had done to my children. They'd paid the price for the system's failures, and I'd been powerless to protect them. Finding work was nearly impossible. Despite my exoneration, Despite the media coverage proving my innocence, employers saw 14 years in prison on my resume and made assumptions. The fact that I'd been wrongfully convicted seemed irrelevant to most people. Finally, Helena Walsh, my former paralegal instructor, offered me a job at her small law firm. She specialized in criminal defense and post-conviction appeals, and she said my experience could be valuable in helping other wrongfully convicted people. "You understand the system from the inside," she said. "You know what it's like to be failed by the very people who are supposed to help you. That perspective is invaluable." The work was meaningful, but it was also triggering. Every case reminded me of my own experience, of the years I'd lost, of the system that had betrayed me. I was helping others navigate the same broken system that had destroyed my life. 3 months after my release, I attended Thomas Crawford's sentencing for Janet Thompson's murder. Seeing him in person was surreal. This was the man whose crime had destroyed my life, whose DNA had finally proven my innocence. He was smaller than I'd expected, ordinary-looking, nothing like the monster I'd imagined. When he stood to address the court, he seemed genuinely remorseful. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry to Janet Thompson's family. I'm sorry to Michael Davis, who spent 14 years in prison for something I did. I was a coward. I should have come forward years ago." His apology didn't give me back the years I'd lost, but it was something. An acknowledgement that my suffering had been real, that I'd been punished for his crime. Janet Thompson's sister spoke at the sentencing. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Mr. Davis, I'm sorry. Our family believed the prosecution, believed that justice had been served. We never questioned it. I'm sorry you paid the price for our need for closure." Her words were unexpected and powerful. The victim's family, the people I'd thought would hate me forever, were apologizing to me. They'd been failed by the system, too, told that justice had been served when the real killer was still free. That night, I sat in my temporary room and looked at my exoneration certificate. It was official proof of my innocence, but it felt inadequate. A piece of paper couldn't restore my relationship with my children, couldn't give me back my wife, couldn't erase the trauma of 14 years in prison, but it was a start. It was proof that the truth had finally come to light, that the system could be corrected, that innocent people could be freed. It was proof that my faith in justice, battered but never broken, had been justified. I was free, but I was also lost. The world had moved on without me, and I was struggling to find my place in it. But I was alive, I was innocent, and I was finally truly free. The exoneration certificate in my pocket was more than just a legal document. It was my passport back to the world of the living, my proof that 14 years of hell had finally ended. 3 months after my release, I was attending a victims' rights meeting at the courthouse. It wasn't something I'd planned to do, but Helena had suggested it might help me process my own experience as a victim of the justice system. The meeting was held in the same building where I'd been convicted 14 years earlier, and walking through those hallways brought back memories I'd tried to bury. The meeting was small, maybe 15 people, all of us dealing with different types of trauma, inflicted by crime or the system meant to address it. I listened to stories of families destroyed by violence, of victims failed by prosecutors, of people struggling to rebuild their lives after unspeakable losses. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. "I'm Michael Davis. I spent 14 years in prison for a murder I didn't commit. I was recently exonerated, but I'm still learning how to be a victim and a survivor at the same time." After the meeting, I was walking toward the parking garage when I heard someone call my name. I turned around and felt my blood freeze. It was Johnson, older, grayer, wearing the same type of ill-fitting suit I remembered from my trial. He looked nervous, almost sick. "Michael," he said, his voice shaky, "could I talk to you for a minute?" My first instinct was to walk away. This man had destroyed my life through his negligence. But something about his demeanor, the way his hands were trembling, the genuine anguish in his eyes made me stop. "What do you want?" I asked, not trying to hide the anger in my voice. "There's a coffee shop across the street," he said. Could we talk, please?" "I know you have every right to refuse, but I need to tell you something." Against my better judgment, I followed him to the small cafe across from the courthouse. We sat in a corner booth, and I watched as Johnson struggled to begin the conversation. He ordered black coffee with shaking hands, and I could see that whatever he wanted to tell me was eating him alive. "I've been following your case," he finally said. "The DNA evidence? The exoneration? I know what happened to you was my fault." "Go on," I said coldly. Johnson pulled out a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was the receipt from our coffee that day, but written on the back in his handwriting were the words I'll never forget. "I never read Michael Davis's case file. Not once. I failed him completely." "I wrote this after I saw the news about your exoneration," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've carried this guilt for 15 years, Michael. I need to tell you the truth." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too hot. The words I'd suspected, the failure I'd always believed had happened, were being confirmed by the man who'd caused it. "You never read my file?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Never," he said, tears starting to form in his eyes. "I was handling over 150 felony cases that year. I was drowning. I was coming to court every day unprepared, hoping I could wing it, hoping I could fake my way through. You paid the price for my incompetence." The confession hit me like a physical blow. 14 years of my life, stolen because an overworked public defender couldn't be bothered to read my case file. My children's childhood sacrificed to his negligence. My marriage destroyed by his failure to do his job. "Do you know what you cost me?" I asked, my voice rising. "Do you have any idea what your laziness did to my life?" "I know," he said, sobbing. "Now, I know, and I've thought about it every day for 15 years. I left public defense after your case. I couldn't handle the guilt. I've been doing real estate law ever since, trying to stay away from criminal cases. Other customers were starting to stare at us. Johnson was falling apart, and I was struggling to contain my rage. This man had stolen my life through nothing more than professional negligence, and now he was asking for what forgiveness? Understanding? "There's more," he said, pulling himself together slightly. "Your case wasn't the only one. I failed dozens of clients during those years, maybe hundreds. The system was broken, and I was just one small part of that failure." The weight of his confession was staggering. It wasn't just my life he'd destroyed, it was case after case of poor defendants who trusted him with their freedom and been betrayed. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I think there are others," he said. "Other innocent people still in prison because I failed them the same way I failed you. And because I think together we might be able to help them." The audacity of his suggestion was breathtaking. The man who destroyed my life was now asking me to help him fix the other lives he'd destroyed. Part of me wanted to throw my coffee in his face and walk away. But another part of me, the part that had spent years helping other inmates with their cases, recognized an opportunity. "Tell me about the other cases," I said, for the next hour. Johnson laid out a pattern of negligence that was systematic and horrifying. Case after case where he'd failed to investigate, failed to challenge evidence, failed to call witnesses, failed to file appeals. Men and women who were probably still in prison because of his incompetence. "I kept lists," he said, pulling out a small notebook. "Names, case numbers, the things I should have done but didn't. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to make this right." I looked at the notebook, filled with Johnson's handwriting, documenting his own failures. It was damning evidence of systemic breakdown, but it was also a roadmap to potential freedom for dozens of wrongfully convicted people. "Why should I trust you?" I asked. "You failed me once. How do I know you won't fail these other people too?" "Because this time I'm not working alone," he said. "This time I have you. You know the system from the inside. You know how to fight these cases. You know what I should have done 15 years ago." The coffee shop receipt with his handwritten confession was still lying on the table between us. This piece of paper was evidence of the conversation that would change everything, not just for me, but for dozens of other innocent people still. Trapped by Johnson's negligence, I picked up the receipt and put it in my pocket. "I'll think about it," I said. As I walked back to my car, I realized that this chance encounter wasn't really chance at all. Johnson had been planning this conversation, carrying his guilt for years, waiting for the right moment to confess. And, I had been preparing for this moment too, learning the skills I'd need to help others. Becoming the advocate that Johnson had never been, the coffee shop receipt in my pocket felt heavy with possibility. It was proof of Johnson's confession. But it was also the beginning of something bigger, a mission to expose the systemic failures that had destroyed so many lives. My personal nightmare was over, but the fight for justice was just beginning. A week after our coffee shop encounter, Johnson appeared at Helena's law office with a manila envelope and a haunted expression. Helena had agreed to let him meet with me there, in a professional setting where our conversation could be properly documented. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told him as we sat across from each other in Helena's conference room. "About the other cases, I need to know everything." Johnson opened the envelope and pulled out a handwritten document, 3 pages, of carefully crafted text that would change everything. At the top, in his neat handwriting, were the words, "Confession of Professional Negligence by Attorney Richard Johnson." "I spent the weekend writing this," he said, his voice steady, for the first time since I'd known him. "It's a complete confession of how I failed you and dozens of other clients. I want to make sure there's a record, something that can be used to help the people I hurt." Helena took the document and read it silently, her expression growing more serious with each paragraph. When she finished, she looked at Johnson with a mixture of disgust and professional curiosity. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "this confession could result in disbarment, malpractice lawsuits, and possibly criminal charges. Are you sure you want to proceed?" "I'm sure," he said. "I can't live with this guilt anymore. These people deserve better than what I gave them." I took the confession and read it myself. It was devastating in its honesty, detailing not just my case but a pattern of negligence that spanned Johnson's entire career as a public defender. He admitted to never reading case files, never interviewing witnesses, never investigating evidence, never filing appeals that should have been filed. The section about my case was particularly damning. In the case of Michael Davis, I failed to read the police reports, failed to interview alibi witnesses, failed to challenge the eyewitness identification, failed to demand proper DNA testing, and failed to file a timely appeal. Mr. Davis spent 14 years in prison as a direct result of my negligence. But the confession went beyond just admitting fault. Johnson had included specific details about other cases, names and case numbers of defendants who might still be in prison because of his failures. It was a roadmap to potential exonerations, a guide to undoing years of damage. "How many cases are we talking about?" I asked. "At least 40, Johnson said. "Maybe more. These are just the ones I can remember clearly, the ones where I know I failed to do basic investigation or failed to file appeals. 40 cases. 40 people whose lives had been destroyed by the same negligence that had cost me 14 years. 40 families torn apart by a system that was supposed to protect them. "I need you to understand something," I said to Johnson. "I hate what you did to me. I hate that you stole my life, my family, my freedom. But I also understand that you're trying to make it right." Johnson nodded, tears forming in his eyes again. "I know I can't give you back those 14 years. I know I can't undo the damage I caused. But maybe we can prevent other people from losing more time," Helena spoke up. "If we're going to pursue this, we need to be strategic. This confession is powerful evidence, but we need to be careful about how we use it. The legal system doesn't like admitting its mistakes, and they'll fight us every step of the way." She was right. Johnson's confession would make waves, but it would also make enemies. Prosecutors who had relied on his inadequate defense to secure convictions, judges who had allowed his incompetence to go unchallenged, a system that had failed to provide adequate resources for public defense. They would all resist efforts to expose the truth. "What's our first step?" I asked. Helena pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. "We need to prioritize the cases. Look for defendants who are still incarcerated, who had the strongest cases for innocence, who might benefit most from immediate action." Johnson opened his notebook and started reading names. "Marcus Thompson, armed robbery. I never challenged the identification. Jennifer Walsh, drug possession. I never filed a motion to suppress illegal evidence. Carlos Rodriguez assault. I never interviewed the alibi witnesses. Each name represented a life potentially destroyed by Johnson's negligence. Each case was a chance to prevent another person from losing years to wrongful conviction. I want to start with Marcus Thompson, I said. Armed robbery cases often have weak evidence, and if you never challenge the identification, there might be grounds for appeal. Over the next 3 hours, we went through Johnson's list methodically. Some cases were stronger than others, some defendants had already been released, and some had died in prison. But there were at least 12 cases where immediate action might save people who were still incarcerated. The most heartbreaking case was Jennifer Walsha, young mother who'd been sentenced to 10 years for drug possession after Johnson failed to challenge an illegal search. She'd already served 8 years and was scheduled for release in 2 years, but if the search was ruled illegal, she could be freed immediately. Her children are in foster care, Johnson said quietly. She writes to me sometimes, asking why I never filed the motion I promised. I never know what to say. You're going to say you're sorry, and then you're going to help us get her out. I replied. By the end of the meeting, we had a plan. Helena would file motions in the most promising cases, using Johnson's confession as evidence of ineffective assistance of counsel. Johnson would cooperate fully, providing testimony and documentation to support the appeals. And I would use my experience and knowledge to help build the strongest possible cases for each defendant. Johnson's handwritten confession would be our smoking gun, undeniable proof of the systematic failures that had destroyed so many lives. But it was also a weapon that could destroy Johnson's remaining career and reputation. Are you sure you're ready for this? I asked him as we prepared to leave. I've been ready for 15 years, he said. I just didn't have the courage to act. Until now. As I walked to my car that evening, I carried Johnson's confession with me, 3 pages that documented one of the most comprehensive failures in the history of public defense. It was evidence of a broken system, but it was also proof that the system could be fixed, one case at a time. The confession was more than just an admission of guilt. It was a commitment to action, a promise that the people Johnson had failed would finally get the representation they deserved. It was the beginning of the most important work I'd ever done, not just fighting for my own freedom, but fighting for the freedom of every person the system had left behind. That night, I read the confession one more time before putting it in my safe. Tomorrow, we would begin the work of undoing 15 years of damage. Tomorrow, we would start bringing people home. Johnson's confession opened the floodgates. But the real evidence of systematic failure was waiting in his abandoned law office. 3 days after our meeting, he led Helena and me to a storage unit where he'd kept boxes of old case files. He'd never properly reviewed, appeals he'd never filed, evidence he'd never examined. The storage unit was a tomb of broken dreams. Dozens of cardboard boxes lined the walls, each one labeled with years that represented the worst period of Johnson's career as a public defender. 2008, 2009, 2010, the years when his caseload had overwhelmed him and his clients had paid the price. I couldn't throw them away, Johnson said as he unlocked the unit. I knew someday I'd have to face what I'd done. Helena and I began opening boxes, and what we found was devastating. Case files that had never been opened, witness statements that had never been read, evidence that had never been examined. It was an archaeological dig through professional negligence, each box revealing new depths of systematic failure. My own case file was in the 3rd box we opened. The file was thin, barely 20 pages, when it should have been hundreds. Johnson had received police reports, witness statements, and forensic evidence, but none of it showed signs of having been studied or analyzed. There were no notes in the margins, no strategic planning documents, no preparation for trial. This is it? I asked, holding up my entire defense file. This is everything you did for my case? Johnson couldn't meet my eyes. I was supposed to interview your coworkers, check your timesheet records, challenge the eyewitness identification. I never did any of it. But the most damning evidence was a manila folder labeled unanswered calls. Inside were dozens of phone messages from clients, people calling to ask about their cases, to provide information, to beg for updates. Johnson had kept the messages but never returned the calls. One message was from my wife. Dated 2 weeks before my trial, Mr. Johnson. This is Michael's wife. We found the timesheet that proves he was at work when the murder happened. Please call us back. This is important. I stared at that message for a long time. My alibi had been sitting in Johnson's office the entire time, ignored and forgotten. A simple phone call could have changed everything, could have saved me 14 years of imprisonment. Helena was documenting everything with her camera, creating a record of each file, each unread document, each missed opportunity. The evidence board we created that day would become crucial in the legal battles. Ahead of visual representation of systematic failure that no court could ignore. Look at this, Helena said, holding up a file marked Jennifer Walsh. Inside was a motion to suppress evidence, the motion Johnson had promised to file but never submitted. The motion was well written, legally sound, and would have resulted in all charges being dropped. Why didn't you file it? I asked. I meant to, Johnson said weakly. I wrote it, but then I got busy with other cases. I forgot. Jennifer Walsh had spent 8 years in prison because Johnson forgot to file a motion he'd already written. Her children had grown up in foster care because of a simple administrative failure. We found similar stories in box after box. Marcus Thompson's file contained witness statements that would have proven his innocence, but Johnson had never contacted the witnesses. Carlos Rodriguez's file had evidence of police misconduct, but Johnson had never challenged it. Case after case of winnable defenses that had never been mounted. The pattern was clear and systematic. Johnson hadn't just failed individual clients, he'd failed the entire concept of legal representation. He'd been a placeholder, a warm body in the courtroom who provided the appearance of defense without any of the substance. How did you get away with this for so long? Helena asked. Didn't anyone notice? The system was broken, Johnson admitted. Judges were rushing through cases, prosecutors were overwhelmed too, and nobody had time to look too closely at what I was doing. As long as I showed up and didn't cause delays, everyone was happy. The most heartbreaking discovery was a box labeled, "Appeals Never Filed." Inside were dozens of notices from the court, informing Johnson that appeal deadlines had passed for his clients. Each notice represented someone who'd lost their right to challenge their conviction because their lawyer had been too negligent to file the necessary paperwork. I found my own appeal notice in that box, the one that had destroyed my hope 15 years earlier. Seeing it again, surrounded by dozens of similar notices, put my experience in context. I wasn't an isolated case of malpractice. I was part of a systematic breakdown that had affected hundreds of people. We need to contact every person in these files, I said. The ones who are still alive, still in prison, still fighting for their freedom. Helena nodded. This is going to be a massive undertaking. We're talking about potentially dozens of wrongful convictions, hundreds of legal motions, years of litigation. But, as overwhelming as the task seemed, I felt energized by the possibility. These boxes represented more than just evidence of failure, they represented opportunity. Each unread file was a chance to provide the defense someone should have received years earlier. Each unfiled appeal was a second chance at justice. We spent the rest of the day cataloging the files, creating a database of Johnson's failures, prioritizing cases based on the strength of potential appeals and the current status of the defendants. By evening, we had identified 15 cases where immediate action might result in freedom for people who were still incarcerated. The evidence board we created told a story that was both devastating and hopeful. On one side, we documented Johnson's systematic failures, the unread files, the unfiled motions, the ignored evidence. On the other side, we outlined our plan for correcting those failures, the appeals we would file, the investigations we would conduct, the defenses we would finally mount. This is going to change everything, Helena said as we locked up the storage unit. When this story gets out, when people see the scope of what happened, it's going to force the entire system to confront its failures. Johnson, who had been quiet most of the day, finally spoke up. I know this doesn't change what I did to you, Michael. I know it doesn't give you back those 14 years, but maybe it can prevent other people from losing more time. looking at him, surrounded by the evidence of his own negligence. I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Johnson was a broken man, destroyed by his own failures, spending his remaining years trying to atone for sins that couldn't be forgiven. But he was also our key to helping dozens of innocent people. The work starts tomorrow, I said. We're going to contact every person in these files. We're going to give them the defense they should have had 15 years ago. The evidence board we created was more than just a visual aid. It was a battle plan. Each case represented a chance to right a wrong, to free an innocent person, to prove that justice could triumph over negligence, but it was also a reminder of how broken the system really was. These boxes contained the wreckage of hundreds of lives, destroyed not by evil intent, but by simple incompetence and systemic failure. As I drove home that night, I thought about all the people still sitting in prison cells, still hoping for appeals that would never come, still trusting lawyers who had already failed them. Tomorrow we would start bringing them home. Tomorrow we would begin the long work of undoing 15 years of damage. The evidence board in Helena's office would guide us through the battles ahead. But the real evidence was in those dusty case files, proof that the system could fail catastrophically, but also proof that it could be redeemed. The first person we contacted was Jennifer Walsh, the young mother who'd been sitting in prison for 8 years because Johnson forgot to file a motion he'd already written. I made the call to the women's correctional facility, my hands shaking. As I dialed the number, "Jennifer, my name is Michael Davis. I was wrongfully convicted 15 years ago, and I recently discovered that we had the same lawyer, Richard Johnson. I'm calling because I think we can help you." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, Jennifer spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you serious? After 8 years, someone is finally going to help me?" "We're going to do everything we can," I promised. "Johnson never filed the motion to suppress the evidence in your case. We found it in his files. It was written, ready to go, but he never submitted it." Jennifer started crying, and I had to pull the phone away from my ear. 8 years of despair. 8 years of watching her children grow up in foster care. 8 years of believing that the system had abandoned her. All of it came pouring out in that phone call. "My kids don't even remember me," she sobbed. "My daughter is 16 now. She was 8 when I was arrested. My son doesn't know I exist." "We're going to get you home," I said. "I promise you, we're going to bring you home to your children." Helena filed Jennifer's motion to suppress evidence the next day. The motion was Johnson's own work, ironically, some of the best legal writing we'd found in his files. It argued that the search of Jennifer's car had been conducted without a warrant or probable cause, making all evidence found during the search inadmissible. While we waited for a hearing date, we began reaching out to other victims of Johnson's negligence. Each phone call was emotionally devastating, but also hopeful. These people had been abandoned by the system, forgotten in prison while their families moved on without them. Marcus Thompson had been in prison for 12 years for an armed robbery he didn't commit. Johnson had never interviewed the alibi witnesses. Who could prove Marcus was at work during the crime? "I kept writing to him," Marcus told me during our first phone call, "asking him to talk to my supervisor to get my timesheet records. He never responded." Carlos Rodriguez had spent 9 years in prison for an assault that video evidence would have disproven if Johnson had bothered to request the security footage from the convenience store where the alleged crime occurred. "The camera was right there," Carlos said. "Everyone knew it was there. But my lawyer never asked for the tape." Each case followed the same pattern: strong evidence of innocence that Johnson had never pursued, clear defenses that he'd never mounted, obvious appeals that he'd never filed. It was systematic failure on a scale I'd never imagined, but building these cases also meant connecting with families who'd been destroyed by the system's failures. I spoke with Jennifer Walsh's mother, who'd been raising Jennifer's children for 8 years while fighting to prove her daughter's innocence. "I've written to every lawyer, every journalist, every politician I could find," she told me. "Nobody would listen. They all said the case was over, that she'd been convicted and had to serve her time." The media attention that followed was intense but necessary. Jennifer Walsh, the local newspaper reporter who'd first covered my case, was eager to investigate the broader pattern of negligence. Her series of articles about Johnson's failures sparked public outrage and political pressure for reform. "This isn't just about individual cases," she wrote. "This is about a systematic breakdown in the constitutional right to effective counsel. Dozens of people are sitting in prison because one overworked lawyer couldn't handle his caseload." The State Bar Association launched an investigation, but we knew their process would be slow and bureaucratic. People were losing years of their lives while administrative procedures ran their course. We needed faster action. Helena suggested a coordinated legal strategy, filing multiple appeals simultaneously, creating media pressure that would force courts to act quickly. It was risky, but it was also our best chance to help the maximum number of people in the shortest time. "We're going to overwhelm the system with the truth," she said. "Make it impossible for them to ignore what happened." The breakthrough came 3 weeks after filing Jennifer's motion. The prosecutor's office, faced with undeniable evidence that the search had been illegal, agreed to drop all charges rather than fight a losing battle. Jennifer Walsh was released that afternoon. I was waiting at the prison gates when she walked out, a small woman in her 30s who looked both older and younger than her years. The reunion with her children was arranged for the next day, but first she wanted to meet the people who'd fought for her freedom. "You saved my life," she said, hugging me with tears streaming down her face. 8 years I've been waiting for someone to care, someone to fight for me. "We're just getting started," I told her. "There are dozens more people who need our help." Jennifer's release generated national media attention. The story of a mother freed after 8 years because her lawyer forgot to file a motion he'd already written captured public imagination and sparked congressional hearings about the crisis in public defense. But for me, the most meaningful moment came when Jennifer was reunited with her children. Her daughter, now 16, was hesitant at first. 8 years was a long time to be separated from a parent. But when they embraced, I saw something I recognized. The healing power of justice finally served. "Mom," her daughter whispered, "I never stopped believing you were innocent." Those words echoed my own daughter's faith in me, reminding me that families don't give up hope even when the system fails them. But they also reminded me how many families were still waiting for their chance at reunion. Marcus Thompson's case was next. His appeal was more complex. We needed to locate alibi witnesses after 12 years. Track down employment records that might have been destroyed, rebuild a defense that should have been mounted more than a decade earlier, but we also had something powerful working in our favor: Johnson's confession and the documentation of his failures. Courts were beginning to take notice of the systematic nature of the problem, and judges were more willing to consider appeals when they understood the broader context. The evidence board in Helena's office grew larger each week, tracking dozens of cases, hundreds of legal motions, and thousands of hours of investigation. Each pin on the board represented a life that had been destroyed by negligence, but also a chance for redemption. "This is the most important work I've ever done," Helena told me one evening as we reviewed the week's progress. These people were abandoned by everyone, their lawyers, the courts, society, but they never gave up hope. By the end of our first month, we'd secured the release of 3 people and filed appeals for 12 others. The pace was exhausting, but the results were undeniable. People who'd been forgotten by the system were finally getting the representation they deserved. The evidence board that tracked our progress was more than just a planning tool. It was proof that systematic failure could be systematically corrected. Each successful case gave us momentum for the next one, and each victory proved that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied, but the work also reminded me daily of the cost of the system's failures. Every person we helped had lost years of their life, had families that had been torn apart, had dreams that had been deferred or destroyed. We could free them, but we couldn't give them back the time they'd lost. Still, watching Jennifer Walsh embrace her children, seeing Marcus Thompson walk free after 12 years, knowing that Carlos Rodriguez would soon be reunited with his family, these moments made every hour of work worthwhile. The evidence board showed our victories, but it also showed how much work remained. Dozens of cases still needed attention. Dozens of people were still waiting for justice. Dozens of families were still hoping for reunions. We were building more than legal cases, we were building hope. The State Bar Association's disciplinary hearing was held 6 months after we'd begun our campaign to free Johnson's abandoned clients. By then, we'd secured the release of 8 people and filed successful appeals for 12 others. The evidence of Johnson's systematic negligence was overwhelming, and the legal community was demanding accountability. The hearing was held in a sterile conference room in the State Bar building, but the weight of the moment was unlike anything I'd experienced. Johnson sat at one end of a long table, flanked by his attorney, while the disciplinary committee, 3 veteran lawyers and a retired judge, reviewed the evidence of his failures. I was called to testify about my own case, about the 14 years I'd lost because Johnson never bothered to read my file. As I spoke, describing the impact of his negligence on my life and my family, I watched Johnson's face. He looked older, more fragile than the man I'd met in that coffee shop 6 months earlier. "Mr. Davis," the committee chairman asked, "what would you say to the argument that Mr. Johnson was simply overwhelmed by his caseload, that the system failed him as much as he failed his clients?" "The system did fail Mr. Johnson," I said carefully. "Public defenders are overworked, underpaid, and under-resourced. But that doesn't excuse his decision to take cases he couldn't properly handle. He had a choice. He could have refused cases, demanded more resources, or left public defense. Instead, he chose to fake his way through, and his clients paid the price." The most powerful testimony came from the people we'd freed. Jennifer Walsh described 8 years of separation from her children because Johnson forgot to file a motion he'd already written. Marcus Thompson talked about 12 years of imprisonment because Johnson never interviewed his alibi witnesses. When Johnson himself testified, he broke down completely. "I failed them," he said, sobbing, "all of them. I took their trust and their freedom and their families, and I threw it all away because I was too proud to admit I was drowning." When the disciplinary committee issued their report 2 weeks later, it was comprehensive and damning. They found that Johnson had violated virtually every standard of professional conduct, recommending permanent disbarment and referring his case to prosecutors for potential criminal charges. The disciplinary committee report became a crucial document in our broader campaign for reform. It provided official recognition of the systematic failures we'd been documenting, giving legitimacy to our calls for change in the public defense system. But for me, the real reckoning wasn't in the formal hearing. It was in the personal conversations Johnson and I had as our work continued. Despite everything he'd done to me, I'd developed a complicated relationship with the man who destroyed my life but was now helping me save others. "Do you forgive me?" he asked one day as we worked together on Marcus Thompson's case. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word. But I understand you better now, and I know that this work we're doing together is the most important thing either of us will ever do." The disciplinary committee report concluded with recommendations that went far beyond Johnson's individual case. They called for systematic reforms to the public defense system, including mandatory caseload limits, increased funding, and better oversight of attorney performance. The legislative hearing room was packed with reporters, advocates, and families affected by public defense failures. I sat at the witness table, looking out at an audience that included Jennifer Walsh and her children, Marcus Thompson and his wife, and dozens of other people whose lives had been transformed by our work over the past year. Senator Patricia Chun, chair of the Judiciary Committee, gavelled the hearing to order. "We're here today to examine proposed legislation to reform our state's public defense system. The Michael Davis Public Defense Accountability Act represents the most comprehensive reform of indigent defense in our state's history." Hearing my name attached to the legislation was surreal. A year earlier, I'd been a recently exonerated man struggling to rebuild his life. Now I was testifying before the state legislature about reforms that could prevent future wrongful convictions. The legislative proposal we developed was comprehensive, addressing every aspect of the public defense crisis that had destroyed so many lives. It established mandatory caseload limits for public defenders, created independent oversight of defense performance, and provided funding for investigative resources that had been lacking for decades. "Mr. Davis," Senator Chun said, Please tell the committee about your experience with the current system and why these reforms are necessary. I'd testified dozens of times over the past year, but this felt different. This wasn't about individual cases or personal grievances. This was about preventing future tragedies. Senators, I began. I spent 14 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit because my public defender never read my case file. Not once. In that file was evidence that could have proven my innocence, witnesses who could have provided an alibi, and a timeline that would have exonerated me. I explained how Johnson's systematic negligence had affected dozens of clients, how his impossible caseload had made competent representation impossible, and how the lack of oversight had allowed the failures to continue for years. This isn't just about one bad lawyer, I said. This is about a system that sets public defenders up to fail and then abandons the clients who pay the price. The proposed legislation addressed each component of the crisis. Caseload limits would ensure that no public defender could handle more than 75 felony cases at one time, less than half of Johnson's peak caseload. Independent oversight would monitor defense performance and intervene when standards weren't being met. But the most important provision was funding for investigative resources. Too many innocent people had been convicted because their lawyers couldn't afford to hire investigators, couldn't access expert witnesses, couldn't challenge the prosecution's evidence. The state spends millions prosecuting cases, I testified. But we spend almost nothing ensuring that defendants get adequate representation. That imbalance has sent innocent people to prison and allowed guilty people to escape justice. Jennifer Walsh testified about the impact of inadequate representation on families. My children spent 8 years in foster care because my lawyer forgot to file a motion, she said. 8 years of their childhood lost because the system failed me. Marcus Thompson spoke about the economic impact of wrongful convictions. I lost 12 years of income, 12 years of building a career, 12 years of supporting my family. The state will pay millions in compensation for my wrongful conviction, but prevention would have cost a fraction of that amount. The opposition to the legislation came primarily from prosecutors and some judges, who worried about increased costs and delays in the system. District Attorney Stevens, the prosecutor who had secured my original conviction, testified that the reforms would be too expensive and would slow down case processing. The current system works efficiently, she argued. Mr. Davis's case was an anomaly, not representative of typical public defense, but our research had proven otherwise. Helena and our team had documented systematic problems across multiple public defender offices, showing that Johnson's failures were part of a broader pattern of under-resourced and overwhelmed defense attorneys. The most powerful moment of the hearing came when Johnson himself testified. The committee had been reluctant to allow him to speak, given his disbarment and the pending criminal charges against him, but we'd argued that his perspective was crucial. I destroyed lives, Johnson said simply. Not because I was evil, but because I was drowning in an impossible caseload and too proud to admit I couldn't handle it. These reforms would have prevented what I did. They would have forced me to get help, to reduce my caseload, or to leave public defense before I could cause so much damage. His testimony was devastating precisely because it came from someone who had no reason to support the reforms except genuine remorse. He detailed the daily impossibility of handling 150 active felony cases, the pressure to plead clients guilty quickly, the lack of time for investigation or preparation. I became a plea bargain machine, he said. My job wasn't to defend clients, it was to process them through the system as quickly as possible. The committee also heard from public defenders who supported the reforms, lawyers who had left public defense because of impossible working conditions, and families who had been affected by inadequate representation. Dr. Amanda Foster, a criminal justice researcher, presented data showing that states with caseload limits and adequate funding had significantly lower rates of wrongful convictions and higher rates of successful appeals. The evidence is clear, she testified. Adequate funding for public defense doesn't just protect individual defendants. It improves the accuracy of the entire justice system. The debate over the legislation continued for months with intense lobbying from both sides. Prosecutors argued that the reforms would be too expensive and would create delays in case processing. Defense advocates countered that the current system was both ineffective and more expensive in the long run. When wrongful convictions resulted in multi-million-dollar settlements, but public opinion was strongly on our side. The stories of Jennifer Walsh, Marcus Thompson, and the other people we'd freed had captured public attention and generated support for reform. Editorial boards across the state endorsed the legislation, and polling showed overwhelming public support. The breakthrough came when Governor Martinez announced her support for the legislation during her State of the State address. No one should spend even one day in prison because their lawyer was too overworked to provide competent representation, she said. The Michael Davis Public Defense Accountability Act will ensure that every defendant gets the representation our Constitution guarantees. The final vote wasn't even close. The legislation passed the Senate 28-12 and the House 89-31, with bipartisan support from lawmakers who recognized that public defense reform was both a constitutional necessity and a fiscal responsibility. At the bill signing ceremony, I stood with Governor Martinez as she signed the legislation into law. The legislative proposal that had started as an idea born from my wrongful conviction was now the law of the land, ensuring that future defendants would receive better representation than I had. This legislation won't bring back the years you lost, the governor said to me after signing the bill, but it will prevent other families from experiencing what you went through. As I walked out of the Capitol building that day, I thought about all the people who would benefit from the reforms we'd fought for. Public defenders who would have manageable caseloads. Defendants who would receive competent representation. Families who wouldn't be torn apart by wrongful convictions. The legislative proposal in my briefcase was more than just a policy document. It was proof that the system could be changed, that individual tragedies could lead to systemic improvements, that justice delayed could still lead to justice for others. My 14 years in prison had been stolen from me, but they'd also given me the knowledge and credibility to fight for changes that would protect thousands of future defendants. The legislative proposal was my lasting contribution to justice, not just for myself, but for everyone who would come after me. 2 years after my exoneration, my daughter graduated from high school. As I sat in the auditorium watching her walk across the stage, I was struck by how much time had passed and how much healing had taken place. The family photo we took that day, all of us together for the first time in years, represented something I had never thought possible. Wholeness after BROKENNESS. The relationship with my children had been the hardest part of rebuilding my life. My daughter, now 19, had memories of me from before my imprisonment, but they were confused with years of absence and doubt. My son, 16, barely remembered me at all. They'd both built lives that didn't include me, developed relationships, and interests and dreams that I'd had no part in shaping. "It's weird having you around," my son said to me one evening as we worked together in the garage. "Not bad weird, just different. I'm not used to having a dad." His honesty was painful, but necessary. I'd missed his entire childhood. And showing up now as a middle-aged man claiming the title of father felt artificial to both of us. We were strangers learning to be family, but gradually, carefully, we found our way to each other. My daughter and I bonded over the legal work I was doing. She was studying pre-law in college, and was fascinated by the cases we'd been working on. My son and I discovered a shared love of baseball, and I started attending his games, trying to make up for years of empty bleachers. The most difficult conversation came when my ex-wife sat me down to talk about the years I'd been gone. She'd remarried, had another child, and built a stable life that my return had disrupted. Her husband, a good man who'd raised my children when I couldn't, was gracious, but understandably protective of the family he'd helped build. "I need you to understand something," my ex-wife said. "I loved you. I believed in you for a long time, but I had to protect our children, and I had to protect myself. I'm not sorry I moved on." "I know," I said. "I'm not sorry either. You did what you had to do. You gave our children a stable home when I couldn't." The conversation was painful, but healing. We'd both made impossible choices in an impossible situation, and recognizing that allowed us to move forward as co-parents, and eventually, as friends. The hardest person to forgive was Johnson. Despite everything we'd accomplished together, despite the people we'd freed and the reforms we'd achieved, I still carried anger toward the man who'd stolen 14 years of my life through simple negligence. Our working relationship had evolved into something resembling friendship, but it was complicated by the massive power imbalance between us. He was seeking redemption. I was the person he'd wronged most severely. He needed my forgiveness more than I needed to give it. The breakthrough came during a visit to see Carlos Rodriguez, one of the men we'd recently freed. Carlos had served 9 years for an assault he didn't commit, and he'd invited Johnson and me to his daughter's quinceañera, the celebration he'd missed while wrongfully imprisoned. Watching Carlos dance with his 15-year-old daughter, seeing the joy on both their faces as they celebrated a milestone he'd thought he'd never witness, I realized something profound about forgiveness. It wasn't about absolving Johnson of responsibility, it was about freeing myself from the burden of carrying anger. "I forgive you," I told Johnson as we drove home from the celebration. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free from this anger." Johnson pulled the car over and wept. "Thank you," he said. "I know I don't deserve it, but thank you." Forgiving Johnson didn't mean forgetting what he'd done or excusing his failures. It meant recognizing that holding on to anger was poisoning my own healing. The family photo from my daughter's graduation showed a man who was learning to smile again, who was building new relationships and finding new purpose. The trauma of wrongful conviction doesn't end with exoneration. The years in prison had left psychological scars that therapy was helping me address. I struggled with claustrophobia, with trust issues, with a hypervigilance that made it difficult to relax. I'd lost 14 years of technological and social development, and adapting to the modern world was an ongoing challenge. But I'd also gained something that few people possess: absolute clarity about what matters. The family photo from graduation wasn't just a record of an achievement, it was proof that love can survive injustice, that families can heal from trauma, that second chances are possible even after devastating loss. My relationship with my children continued to evolve. My daughter decided to become a public defender herself, inspired by the work we'd done together. "I want to be the lawyer you should have had," she told me. My son, while not interested in law, became one of my strongest supporters, proudly telling friends about his father's advocacy work, the financial compensation for my wrongful conviction. $50,000 for each year I'd spent in prison-prided security but couldn't buy back time. Money couldn't restore my relationship with my children or give me back the milestones I'd missed, but it did allow me to focus on advocacy work without worrying about basic survival. I used part of the settlement to start a foundation supporting families of wrongfully convicted people. The foundation provided financial assistance, emotional support, and legal resources to people navigating the aftermath of wrongful conviction. It was my way of ensuring that other families wouldn't suffer alone the way mine had. The most meaningful healing came through my work with other exonerees, meeting people who'd experienced similar injustices, who understood the unique trauma of wrongful conviction, provided a sense of community I'd never expected to find. We were a brotherhood forged by injustice but united by our commitment to preventing others from sharing our fate. At my daughter's graduation party, surrounded by family and friends, I looked at the photo we'd taken that day. It showed a family that had been broken by injustice but had found its way back to wholeness. We weren't the same family we'd been before my arrest. Too much had happened, too much time had passed. But we were a family nonetheless, bound by love that had survived the worst the system could inflict. The process of healing wasn't linear or simple. Some days were better than others. Some relationships were easier to rebuild than others. But the family photo from graduation represented something I'd thought was lost forever: hope for the future, joy in the present, and peace with the past, forgiveness. I'd learned wasn't a single act but an ongoing choice. Every day I chose to focus on what I'd gained rather than what I'd lost, on the people I'd helped rather than the years I'd missed, on the love that surrounded me rather than the injustice that had defined me for so long. The family photo My daughter's graduation hangs in my office now, next to pictures of all the people we've helped free, all the families we've reunited, all the reforms we've achieved. It reminds me daily that healing is possible, that justice can prevail, and that even the most devastating losses can lead to unexpected blessings. I'd lost 14 years, but I gained a purpose, a mission, and a deeper appreciation for the preciousness of freedom and family. The photo captures not just a moment of celebration, but a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to overcome even the gravest injustices. 3 years after my exoneration, I stood in front of a new office building with a sign that read, "The Michael Davis Foundation for Justice Reform." It wasn't something I'd ever imagined having an organization named after me, but it represented the culmination of everything we built since that first coffee shop conversation with Johnson. The foundation's mission was simple but ambitious: to ensure that no one else would suffer what I'd suffered. We provided legal assistance to wrongfully convicted people, supported families during the appeals process, and advocated for systemic reforms to prevent future injustices. Helena had agreed to serve as the foundation's legal director, bringing her expertise and passion for justice to our growing team. Johnson, despite his disbarment, worked as an investigator and consultant, using his knowledge of systemic failures to help identify cases where inadequate representation might have led to wrongful convictions. "It's ironic," Johnson said during our foundation's opening ceremony. "I destroyed so many lives through my negligence, and now I'm trying to save lives by documenting that same negligence in other cases." The business card I carried now identified me as executive director of the Michael Davis Foundation, but the title felt inadequate to describe what we were really doing. We were more than just another nonprofit organization. We were a living testament to the possibility of redemption, proof that the most devastating injustices could be transformed into forces for positive change. Our work had expanded far beyond Johnson's original cases. We were now handling appeals for wrongfully convicted people across the country. Using the expertise we developed and the credibility my story had given us to fight injustice wherever we found it. The foundation's conference room was lined with photos of the people we'd helped free, 37 so far, with dozens more cases in progress. Each photo represented not just an individual victory, but a family reunited, a life restored, a small victory for justice. But the foundation also kept photos of the people we couldn't save, defendants who died in prison before we could help them, cases where evidence had been destroyed, families who'd given up hope before we found them. These photos reminded us that our work was urgent, that every day we delayed meant another day of injustice for someone who was counting on us. The most rewarding part of our work was seeing the ripple effects of our successes. Jennifer Walsh, the mother who'd been separated from her children for 8 years, now worked as a victim's advocate, helping other families navigate the aftermath of wrongful conviction. Marcus Thompson had become a paralegal, using the skills he'd learned in prison to help other defendants. "You saved my life," Jennifer told me at our annual gala. "But more than that, you gave me a purpose. Everything I do now is about preventing other families from going through what we went through." The foundation's advocacy work had also expanded. The Michael Davis Public Defense Accountability Act had been adopted by 6 other states, and federal legislation was pending in Congress. Our research and documentation of systemic failures had become a model for reform efforts nationwide. Johnson's continued cooperation had been crucial to our success. His detailed knowledge of how the system failed, combined with his genuine remorse and commitment to making amends, had made him an invaluable asset despite his past failures. "I can't give you back those 14 years, he said to me during a quiet moment at the gala, "but maybe we can prevent someone else from losing even 1 year." The foundation's work had also attracted the attention of law schools, which began using our cases as teaching tools. Students studied my wrongful conviction as an example of how systemic failures compound, and they analyzed our advocacy work as a model for how individual tragedies can drive systemic change. My daughter, now in her 2nd year of law school, was writing her thesis on wrongful convictions and post-conviction advocacy. "You're famous, Dad," she teased me. "My professors know your case better than I do." But fame wasn't what I was seeking. What mattered was impact, the knowledge that our work was preventing future injustices, that the reforms we'd fought for were protecting defendants who would never know how close they'd come to experiencing what I'd experienced. The Foundation's annual report that year documented not just our successes, but the ongoing needs we were trying to address. Despite all our progress, despite all the reforms we'd achieved, innocent people were still being wrongfully convicted. The system was better than it had been, but it was far from perfect. The business card in my wallet represented more than just my current job. It represented a mission that would likely continue for the rest of my life. Every time I handed that card to someone, I was making a promise that their case would be taken seriously, that their claims of innocence would be investigated, that they wouldn't be abandoned the way I'd been abandoned. The most profound moment of our Foundation's third year came when we received a letter from a young public defender in another state. She'd read about our work and wanted to know how to avoid the mistakes Johnson had made, how to provide competent representation despite overwhelming caseloads. "I don't want to fail my clients the way Johnson failed you," she wrote, "but I'm drowning in cases and don't know how to stay afloat." Her letter reminded me that our work wasn't just about freeing the wrongfully convicted. It was about supporting the people who were trying to prevent wrongful convictions in the first place. We began offering training and resources to public defenders, helping them manage their caseloads and provide better representation. The Foundation had become something I'd never expected when I walked out of prison, a legacy of hope born from the worst experience of my life. Every person we freed, every reform we achieved, every family we reunited, was proof that even the most devastating injustices could be transformed into forces for good. As I sat in my office at the end of that third year, looking at the photos of all the people we'd helped, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. 14 years of wrongful imprisonment had been followed by 3 years of advocacy work that had freed dozens of innocent people and reformed systems that had failed countless others. The business card that identified me as executive director was more than just a title. It was a promise. A promise that no one would fight alone, that every claim of innocence would be taken seriously, that the system could be changed by people who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. I'd lost 14 years of my life to a broken system, but I'd found a purpose that gave meaning to every day that followed. The Foundation wasn't just my legacy, it was proof that redemption was possible, that hope could triumph over despair, and that even the gravest injustices could be transformed into forces for positive change. My story had begun with a nightmare, an innocent man convicted of a crime he didn't commit, but it had become something else. A testament to the power of persistence, the importance of truth, and the possibility that even the most broken systems could be healed by people who refused to give up hope. The business card in my wallet was small, but it represented something enormous. The promise that justice, though sometimes delayed, could ultimately prevail.